The marketing personas certainly change, but the objectives on the HR side, as well as for many of the departments in any organization, I would submit are oftentimes very similar. What I mean by that is we recognize that there's the old strategy, execution, and the timeline, etc. And so ultimately, that employer brand is helping them, of course, with build a reputation.
All right, welcome back to the Lanteria podcast. I'm super excited today to welcome Ken Finneran, who is with us. Ken is here to discuss a really exciting topic about employer branding, which is something that I think doesn't get discussed enough. We talk a lot about marketing, we talk a lot about branding, but we don't talk about the importance of, putting the brand out there as an employer and how important that is for recruiting. So welcome to the show, Ken, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you and your listeners today. Really appreciate it.
No, I was excited to discuss this topic, so it was great that you brought it up and you had so much passion for it. So if you don't mind, just give us a couple minutes, breakdown on what you do, who you work for, where you've been, and let the audience know sort of what your background is.
Sure thing. My pleasure. So over the years, I've been in the HR space for over 25 years, consider myself a strategic HR and talent executive, an HR innovator, and certainly a community builder as well. Over the years, I've had the pleasure, I grew up in the Midwest in the U.S., in Indianapolis, then had the pleasure of studying in Washington, D.C., as well as internationally in Vienna, Austria, and Bonn, Germany. And I lived in Europe for about 15 years in Austria, Germany, Poland, and the UK, in addition to working here in the US. So oftentimes I bring that international experience and that diverse global perspective to the CHRO function. From a work perspective, I've been leading the strategic global HR function since November of 2021 for eMed, which is a leading digital health tech company that's on a mission to democratize healthcare. And what that essentially means is we are a technology-driven digital health company and the test-to-treat pioneers who offer peace of mind to individuals by sharing a growing set of telehealth kits that allow people to be screened and then to receive telehealth visits and RX treatments for common ailments essentially from anywhere. Prior to joining eMed, I served as the VP of Global HR at 𝗓𝗧 and the CHRO, Chief Human Resources Officer at National Beverage Corp, driving their respective hypergrowth phases in the organizations as they grew to multi-billion-dollar enterprises, by each growing over 400% during the couple of years that I was with each of those organizations. I love the HR function, have been honored with several awards, and love speaking on topics of strategic HR and talent management, including this important one, as you said, employer branding, and overall on the future of HR.
So, I mean, you've obviously worked for some like high growth kind of companies. I assume eMed is probably a high growth company based on the fact that it's a tech company. Can you walk us through, just from your perspective, the importance of employer branding and how it impacts, especially in like a high growth type of company where, I mean, you're doing a lot of recruiting, you're also probably turning over a lot of people. So you want to make sure that you are positioning yourself as a brand. So I just want to understand sort of the background of your passion for it, sort of what your positioning is in this.
I so much appreciate the question. And certainly anytime I'm talking about employer branding, I personally love to start by defining what it means to me. It doesn't mean that everyone shares that definition, but some folks I've seen believe it's only how you market your company to desired candidates. And certainly that's a part of it. I think others believe it's about trying to qualify your organization for best workplace awards. I think still others say it's just the other side of the coin of employee engagement. But for me, it's really about branding and marketing the entirety of the employee experience. So what that means for me is it describes the employer's reputation, brand itself as a place to work. It highlights the employee value proposition and the overall employee experience. So it goes beyond just the pre-hire or the recruiting, but directly to your question then about how it impacts a high growth environment like I've been in the last 3 companies. Certainly when you are doing a lot of hiring, this is a topic, employer brand, that is important and has been deemed important by over 80% of candidates looking to join organization. And yet even self-described when HR leaders are asked about it. Only less than 40% of companies say that they do an adequate job in promoting their employer brand. In my 25 plus years of HR experience, I see there's just still a lack of sufficient attention being paid to employer brand. And yet we see the popularity of sites like Glassdoor built in, and then the specific sites that even highlight employer brand and company reputation. And it is an important part for candidates. I've been passionate about this in part, not just because I'm in HR and see candidates responding well to it, but there's real business impact to that. And what I mean by that is in a hyper-growth phase, retention becomes extremely important, as does the ability to attract the best and brightest. eMed is actually, we still consider ourselves a startup, being operational for only the last 2.5 years. So in that, it's important for the best and brightest in our industry to want to work for us. And a strong employer brand certainly helps with that. But I've been passionate about this topic for, goodness, 20 plus years, even as I was in Central Europe and helping companies establish their own strong employer brands at a time when a lot of, I'll call it, Western companies were moving into the region and thinking that just a strong consumer brand would be enough to have people want to work for their organization without putting in the effort to actually establish what is needed as a best place to work, in a desired place to work and to thrive as an employee. So it is multifaceted for sure. And I've been blessed over the years to work for a number of companies that value and support the employer brand, including here at eMed. But to grow and thrive, I'd add that extra element that it does take a sustained dedication and commitment, not just from the HR function, but from marketing and from senior leadership as well.
So how does that work? I mean, your buy-in, like usually who is sort of the group that you're working close with when it comes to employer brand? Like, are you working with the marketing team? How do you fight for a budget for this? Because I mean, I assume marketing says like, okay, this is interesting, but I want my budget for what I want to do. How do you convince them like, hey, let's take this budget and let's do this, and sort of some examples of how you've done that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's probably even a little easier in a small to mid-sized enterprise like where I am, where we're all trying to build and grow and share key messages, brand messages to stakeholders, broadly speaking. But I think I'd start there by saying we share and build recognition internally, develop champions like for any initiative. And that is, in my case, I have the support in terms of corporate culture building initiatives. I share that responsibility with our CEO. So when the CEO and I then go to the director of marketing and say, I know you're responsible for delivering consistent brand messages to external stakeholders, I would love to work with you and partner, as well as with Dr. Harris, our CEO, on using some of the marketing dollars, branding dollars, and spend that is usually more significant and available than the HR spend to get our message out that's going to, at the end of the day, promote what we are trying to achieve as an organization overall. So I think it's a partnership with marketing. It's trying to engage other senior level leaders, in my case, the CEO, because we see significant overlap in our objectives. In larger organizations, I too have certainly advocated for and would recommend that close partnership with marketing because those funds, as I said, are more readily available there. But it's interesting because I try to liken it back and bring in data whenever I can. And you may be familiar with an organization called the Institute for Corporate Productivity, I4CP, and they published a study that noted that just over a quarter of companies surveyed had the collaboration between HR and marketing in place regarding employer branding, strategy, and execution. But what I found more important even than that stat is that they also look at what they call high-performance organizations and differentiate those from the average, and that high-performance organizations are 6 times more likely to have that collaboration in place. So I go into a meeting with the CEO and the director of marketing and say, look, I know we never aspire to be average. And as we're trying to become best in class and world class, we know that this is one of the hallmarks hallmarks of those organizations. And it just supporting the arguments with that type of data oftentimes helps get over the hurdle. And then one of the other things that I'm always quick to point out is there is a misconception that employer branding initiatives always have to cost some huge amount of money. And yet, especially...
There's that marketing misconception that unless you're spending the money, it's not doing anything.
That's exactly right. And, you had asked, what are some of those things? Well, community engagement goes such a long way. And that's encouraging whether it's myself or some of my peers and colleagues to sit on within the local chambers or even national chambers on committees and subcommittees, having speaking engagements and sharing thought leadership out there, partnering with local universities on a number of things, developing internship and apprenticeship programs. These are all things that help build an employer brand and can be even no cost to organizations. And I think leveraging some of those things first actually really helped us get our name out there and not having to even ask for a large set of dollars to really build employer brands. Certainly once we started going to conferences and having a booth or things like that, we often shared our booth. So we used it from a recruiting function as a recruiting tool, while marketing was there sharing brands. So our COVID kit, some of our eMed screen kit, and others with their potential customers. So it again became a joint initiative to reach our joint goals as an organization.
And how do you, you mentioned at the beginning, you've worked at some organizations that are very different. Like they're industries that don't, a lot of times don't have any overlap between consumer goods to e-medicine. Does your approach change? I know from, a lot of people say about like marketing is, it's pretty much the same thing no matter which market you're getting into. It's just a matter of, the type of buyer persona and everything's the same. But like, how do you change for each one? Because I assume each culture is probably really different for each company. The type of people you're going after. So how do you adjust sort of your playbook?
Well, it's a great question. And I think the marketing personas certainly change, but the objectives on the HR side, as well as for many of the departments in any organization, I would submit are oftentimes very similar. What I mean by that is we recognize that there's the old strategy, execution, and the timeline, et cetera. But in nearly any organization, especially those that employ knowledge workers, if we want to use that term, they are realizing and executing against that strategy through teams and through people.
Okay.
And so ultimately, that employer brand is helping them, of course, with build a reputation, building that brand, but to recruit, hire, develop, assess, evaluate, and grow the employees and the organization through a joint set of efforts. Like most organizations, they say, we want the best and the brightest. Well, if it is, in my opinion, impossible to do that without strong brand. And maybe to just a story around that, in the last organization I was with prior to eMed, we were going through hypergrowth, grew about 500% in 2.5 years. During that time, as we were successfully building out and enhancing our employer brand through a multi-year strategy, our employee turnover actually went down 3 to 5% every year. So normally you expect in hyper growth environments, it's the other way around, that you're losing more because you can't devote enough to that. If you're branding, and again, this is because it is a comprehensive strategy that goes beyond the pre-employment of saying we're a great company. That's a component of it. But I would say another key piece of that is, what are you doing once the people are inside? Are your managers leading the teams with trust, transparency, empowerment, etc.? Because if not, your employer brand is going to be inconsistent. And it's that congruency is what you're quote unquote selling on the outside, consistent with what your employees are experiencing once they're in the company. Because otherwise, as much as you try to promote it on the outside, it's going to fall flat.
Yeah. You're going to churn. It's not even going to seem real. Once people get in, they're like, well, wait a second. This doesn't look like the pictures.
That's right. Someone sold me a bill of goods. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's like going to an Airbnb where the pictures have like great lighting, and then you get inside and you're like, wait a second, this is like a basement. How did I?
100%. Yes.
How do you? I mean, you've come from hypergrowth or like very fast growing companies. I always view, I mean, my knowledge, my experience in fast growing companies, and my knowledge from talking to some HR peers, I always view them as like almost like a snake that is shedding its skin as it grows. Because I mean, you're getting new people in that fit certain levels. I mean, if you're at 10 million ARR, you need different people than when you're at 1, and you need different people when you're at 50 than when you're at 10. How do you maintain that brand? There is certain turnover necessary to continue to grow because you need a different profile.
I'm smiling because I had a conversation earlier today with some of our corporate leaders, and we were talking about the team that is in place as well as our next growth initiatives and what that means. And I made the comment that, well, as times change, teams need to change too.
Yeah.
So, and
Definitely.
there's a huge hesitation to be willing to do that. Oh, they've stuck with us over this last year or 2 years. It doesn't mean that they are bad people. And yet I tell that story as somewhat a tangent, but it's important that the values and the corporate culture that you've been aspiring to, that oftentimes isn't going to be changing as much as the teams and the strategic steps needed and the strategic initiatives around the people that are needed in those roles. So your brand can be consistent. It will always be evolving. A brand is not it shouldn't be stagnant.
Yeah.
And yet so it too will be evolving, but it goes about how are we living that brand now? So for us, that means, okay, we had been focused on more junior enterprise roles or whatever that would be. We now need more consultative, almost coach-like individuals in this. And they may not be the same individual, likely are not the same individuals. And yet from a branding perspective, the strong brand that we have to say we have been able to grow. We are the innovation leader in this space. We are the growth leader in this space. We are a partner with the FDA, the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, et cetera, because they acknowledge our telehealth excellence. And as we're democratizing healthcare, you have the opportunity to be on the front line to disrupt this whole industry that's ripe for disruption. Do you want to join us? And again, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but essentially that is the story that remains fairly consistent, but the types of individuals we're going after may be different each time.
But does it, as you shed some of those lower, I mean, I know of friends of mine that are CEOs of companies that are devastated by like Glassdoor reviews and things that happen. But a lot of times, you know, when you look behind the scenes from the employer perspective, they say, you know, I mean, we just had a group of people that was right for a certain phase and we had to change the phase, and the brand might have stayed the same, everything stayed the same, but they got nailed because all these negative reviews came in because they made this big change, but because they had to. There was no, you couldn't keep the same people because you can't have the same players. Like you said, you need coaches sometimes. You need other people to come in, and those other people need to bring in other skill levels and other skill sets. How do you fight through that sort of difficult moment where, you know, it's you're making that big change and you got to protect the brand at the same time?
I've had a couple of experiences where it was necessary to take one step back before moving 2 steps forward, and not to be afraid of that. And so to have the, I'll call it managerial courage to say, as long as we're clear about who we are and who we want to be, we can tell a compelling story. That's part of that employer brand, a hugely important part of that, to those who are looking to join us and who share some of those values. That may be a different story and likely will be a different story than we were telling last year. And that's okay, because in order to survive and thrive, we need to evolve. And we're going to give those who have been with us through our journey the opportunity to grow, develop, enhance their own skills through learning and development initiatives, reskilling, upskilling. Those are some of the things where those marketing dollars really come into play, is investing also internally in those upskilling and reskilling capabilities. But it also means these same people who were in certain roles probably aren't going to be in those leadership roles all the time, because to be a thriving organization, we need to be on the cusp of change. And certainly in a startup world, that's it's always about that. And so I've actually experienced this in hyper-growth organizations very much the same. PE-backed or in general, hyper-growth organizations are all about the right teams for the right time. And yet that doesn't mean that they're going to be those same roles forever.
One of the things when you're a startup to attract people is to give them a title, an interesting title. It's like, hey, you're the COO of this company now, and there's like 20 people in the company.
Yeah.
And one of the hardest parts is that next stage when all of a sudden instead of 20, there's 200 people. And all of a sudden the COO is like, he's really like the operations manager of a specific group, and that's it. And you got to figure out like how to shake it off. And we're to bring in this new COO. And I know a lot of people that have struggled with that movement. It's like, okay, we got to bring in someone. We're going to give them your title and your job now. It's always one of the biggest struggles, I think, for fast growing companies is that transition.
I think it is. And one way we've at least discussed that, I'm not going to say that it's the right answer if there even is a right answer for that circumstance. But we tell people early on, even in the onboarding, when they ask, tell me a little bit about the organization, we said, we treat our mission and our values very seriously. And we want our behaviors and encourage you to embrace those behaviors that will positively reflect those values and our mission. And yet we don't treat ourselves too seriously. And that means we can joke about some of the mistakes we made last week. It means that we are okay with changes happening. We're not tied to a title or a seat or an office. For goodness sakes, I've had 4 offices in the less than 2 years that I've been here, because that's a normal part of a startup environment.
Yeah. It's something people need to, I think, unless you've been in that environment before, it's definitely a struggle for people. I don't know if you guys are remote, if you're hybrid, I don't know what your structure is, but how has your opinion of like an employer brand changed with remote work? Because I know there's a huge debate. Like I spend a lot of time on Twitter. There's a huge debate around, people have moved away from, I'm going to go do things with my colleagues at work to, hey, I want to be with my family or I want to be with my friends. And for me, work is this, area of my life, while work from home or remote work has made it so I can all of a sudden have a much more amplified version of myself at home. How does the employer brand fit into that? Because it is a huge shift, because you do want people, really dedicated. And that's what the last 15 years is let's dedicate to this. Let's be a team, a family, so to speak. A lot of people talk about making a family, but a lot of people all of a sudden now, like in 2020, they open up, they're like, wait a second, this is my family. This is my work. How do you adapt your brand to that change?
I'm going to answer this in 2 parts. It's a great question. And the reason I'm going to answer it in 2 parts is because as a startup organization where the collaboration, and we've launched, as an example, 2 new business units even this very year. So again, it is super fast paced. And as a result, those hallway conversations, we have more collaboration spaces than we do meeting rooms. So we are in office 5 days a week now. We had, especially for our tech and engineering team, started as 3 days hybrid. That became 4 days, 4 in, 1. Now they too are back in the office. Again, the question is a good one. I think it is when a brand, an employer brand, talks about things like adaptability, when they talk about speed, when they talk about trust, when they talk about upward advancement and mobility, whether they are in office or out of office, it's how is that reflected in the day-to-day actions of leadership? And how does that then become reflected in promotions? How does that become reflected in connections as well? And I think what I'm seeing and hearing from a lot of my peers is it's one of the things that a lot of HR professionals are also struggling with when it comes to reviews, etc. Yes, 2 years they've started getting used to in training around how do you lead a remote workforce. And yet when we think about those who are now ready for upward mobility, meaning advancement within the corporation to higher levels of responsibility, it's become a much tougher exercise for those HR professionals as well as team leaders to say, I don't really know because I haven't observed that in the same way that I could in the past. So for me, I think when it comes to the brand, it is committing to the same, whether you're hybrid or in office or fully remote, making sure that you have the opportunities for what you had said, family versus work, whether we call that work-life balance. I've never been a fan of the term. term, but because I think they've always been blended, to be quite honest. But to have some type of an acknowledgement of that, to acknowledge why many employees want the remote and enjoy the remote or hybrid atmosphere, but how are we still enabling the pieces of our strong employer brand that have been things like opportunities for internal advancement, opportunities for learning and development? Have we expanded our online capabilities of learning and development since more of our team is remote, or have we kept it the same yet are still expecting them to do that? That would then be an inconsistency. The same for employee engagement activities. Have we only stuck with a summer picnic and a holiday party when everyone is remote and can't get together? If so, that's an inconsistency. So I guess the answer is, how are we shifting also what we are doing in terms of an employer brand to mirror whatever our philosophy is as an organization? How are we enabling the functions that help, again, develop that congruency or consistency with what we're telling the outside and how we reflect that on the inside in terms of how we enable that overall employee experience? But also when we're talking with candidates on the outside, if we say we are open, collaborative, and highly flexible, and the first thing they ask is that with your work schedules as well, and you say no, then they're going to question everything about your brand.
Yeah. No, you're right. It's something I know a ton of other CEOs that I'm friends with struggle with, because they do, they want to keep up with the market, but they also want to, be consistent. They want to attract the best talent. And I think a lot of people are finding it difficult to mark their territory and sort of say what we are. And it's a big struggle. So for me, the brand part that we're discussing is so interesting there, because a lot of people probably had to change their brand over the last 2 years, 3 years, and really totally change and then go back to what really is what they wanted at the beginning, which was maybe 5 days in the office, or going back to the normality. So for me it's really interesting, sort of the sea change in like how people work, where they work. Employment has been interesting. That's why for me, HR right now is one of the most interesting places to be, because there's so many shifts going on in how people do things. I really appreciate all your time, and I appreciate this in-depth discussion. And I mean, you gave me a lot to actually think about. I wrote down a lot of things for our own company. I think our companies are quite different, but I think there was a lot of pointers that you gave me. So hopefully everyone that's listening also had their pen and paper and wrote some things down. So thank you so much for this, and we appreciate it. And if you want to share any websites or places where people can find you, where you're sharing any of your thoughts or anything like that, I'll also put links in the website.
Absolutely, will do. And so certainly you can find me on LinkedIn, but also hashtag Ken HR Innovator is the hashtag. And in general, I'll send you to share with the group some of the most recent articles and places where I've been published talking about some of these and other HR topics.
Awesome. Doing your branding work for your company.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. 100%. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a true pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks, Ken. It was great to have you. Thank you.
All right. Have a great one.
Bye.
Bye-bye.